He was just a bounty hunter, another face on another wanted poster. $500 for a cattle rustler named Silas Barton. For Jedediah Calloway, it was just another Tuesday. He had no idea that kicking in one cabin door would unravel a conspiracy that led all the way back to the day his wife and daughter were burned alive. The wind was cold that October, a promise of the winter to come. It whipped the wanted poster in his hand, the paper stained with the dust of the Colorado mountains. Jed didn't care about the cold. He'd felt a deeper chill inside him for 7 long years, a cold that never left. He studied the face on the poster. Cold eyes, a jagged scar, a bad man. Jed was good at finding bad men. He tucked the poster into his leather vest and settled behind a boulder, his Winchester rifle resting easy in his hands. Below him, in a valley of pine and aspen, a thin wisp of smoke finally rose from a cabin chimney. His quarry was home. Jed took a slow, measured breath. Patience was a tool, just like his rifle, and he was a master of both. He gathered his weapon and began his descent into the valley, his boots making no sound on the pine needles. He didn't knock. The cabin door splintered inward with a single powerful kick. Jed was a ghost in the doorway, rifle raised, the setting sun at his back. Silas Barton, the man with the scar, was just reaching for his supper. He froze, his hand hovering over the plate, his eyes wide. He barely had time to register what was happening before Jed's voice cut through the silence. "I wouldn't," Jed said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a tombstone. Barton's hand dropped. His eyes narrowed, recognition dawning on his scarred face. "Calloway," he breathed. "They sent the best." "Drop the gun belt," Jed commanded. "Slow." Barton complied, his movements careful. The heavy belt thudded onto the rough-hewn floor. He looked at Jed, a flicker of calculation in his eyes. "You planning on taking me in alive? That's a long, dangerous ride back to Denver." "That depends on you," Jed said, his face a mask of stone. He took a step into the room. 5 men died in that raid on the Hancock Ranch. One of them was just a boy, 16 years old. For the first time, something other than fear crossed Barton's face. It looked almost like shame. "Wasn't supposed to go that way," he mumbled. "Hancock's boy. He wasn't meant to be there." Jed studied the man. He wasn't just looking at an outlaw, he was looking at a reflection. A broken man, haunted by choices that could never be undone. He'd seen that same hollow-eyed stare in his own mirror every morning for 7 years. It was the look of a man who had lost everything. "You got family?" Jed asked. The question hung in the air, unexpected. Barton flinched, as if struck. "A wife," he said, his voice cracking. "2 little ones, in Pueblo. Haven't seen them in 3 years. Jed nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Write them a letter," he said. "You've got 5 minutes." Barton stared, his mouth agape. Disbelief warred with a desperate flicker of hope. "What?" "5 minutes," Jed repeated, gesturing with his rifle toward a small table in the corner where a pen and paper lay. This small act of mercy wasn't weakness. It was a ritual, a recognition of the life about to be extinguished. Even the condemned deserved a final word. As Barton scribbled his last words to a family he would never see again, Jed kept the Winchester trained on him. The letter was sealed. Jed took it with his free hand, tucking it away. "I'll see it gets delivered." "Thank you," Barton whispered, the words rough and unpracticed. He looked up, a plea in his eyes. "Will you? Will you tell them I died fighting? Died quick?" "Maybe," Jed said. "I'll tell them you faced the end with dignity and regret." The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor as Jed secured Barton's hands with iron cuffs. The decision to bring him in alive had been made in that single moment of recognition. Not for the bounty, but for the man. A man who, like him, was already living in a hell of his own making. The small stone marker stood in the shadow of a gnarled pine tree. It was one of dozens in the humble cemetery behind Valley Creek's white-steepled church. Jed knelt before it, his hat in his hands. He placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. The inscription was simple, carved deep into the cold stone. Elizabeth Calloway, Sarah Calloway, beloved wife and daughter. Gone to God's embrace, 1869. 7 years. It felt like 7 minutes and 7 lifetimes all at once. The ache was a living thing inside him, as fresh as the day he'd returned from a bounty hunt in Wyoming to find nothing but smoldering ash where his home once stood. Elizabeth, with her gentle laugh. Little Sarah, just 6 years old, with his eyes and her mother's spirit. Gone. Both gone. "I miss you both," he whispered, the words swallowed by the wind. "Every day." The church bell tolled the hour. Jed rose, settling his hat back on his head. He'd delivered Barton to the authorities in Denver 3 days ago, collected his money, and now, like a moth to a flame, he was drawn back here, to Valley Creek, a place that held both his greatest joy and his deepest pain. He walked down the town's main street. It had changed. New storefronts, more people. The railroad was coming, transforming everything. It was a town moving forward, while he was still trapped in the past. That's when he saw the commotion at the courthouse. A crowd had gathered on the steps, their faces a mixture of amusement and discomfort. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't felt in years, pulled him forward. He pushed through the crowd, and what he saw made his jaw tighten. At the top of the courthouse steps, 5 women stood in a line. They looked frightened, resigned. 4 were dressed simply, but the 5th woman, she was different. Her ankles were bound in heavy iron chains. Her dress was a tattered gray rag. Her skin was marked with dirt and bruises, and her dark hair hung in tangled waves, hiding her face. Standing before them was Judge Harrison Patterson. Jed remembered him. A man with a reputation for harsh sentences and an unbending interpretation of the law. His hair was silvered now, but his commanding presence was the same. "Gentlemen of Valley Creek," Patterson's voice boomed across the crowd. "As is our custom with women who have violated the town's moral codes, we offer them a chance at redemption through matrimony." A murmur went through the crowd. Jed had heard of this barbaric practice. Women arrested for minor offenses, offered up for marriage instead of jail. A cruel trade, one cage for another. "The first 4 ladies have committed minor infractions," Patterson continued. "But as for this one..." His voice hardened as he turned to the chained woman at the end of the line. Something in his tone made Jed's skin crawl. "This woman stands accused of more serious crimes. But in the spirit of Christian charity, she too is offered this opportunity, rather than the cell she so richly deserves." Jed studied the chained woman. Despite her appearance, she stood straight. Her chin was lifted in defiance. When she shifted, he caught a glimpse of her face. She was young, maybe late 20s, with striking features hidden beneath the grime. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were clear, intelligent, and they burned with a contained fury. The auction began. The first 2 women were quickly claimed by men in the crowd. Jed found his gaze repeatedly drawn back to the woman in chains. There was a strength in her that didn't belong in this humiliating spectacle. The chains seemed excessive, the treatment unnecessarily cruel. Whatever she had done, this was wrong. Then a voice cut through the noise. "Calloway." Jed looked up, startled. Judge Patterson was staring directly at him, a strange, unsettling smile playing on his lips. "I thought that was you, lurking at the back. Come up here." Reluctantly, Jed made his way through the murmuring crowd and up the courthouse steps. He could feel every eye in town on him. The widower, the bounty hunter, the ghost of Valley Creek's past. Jedediah Calloway, Patterson announced, has brought more criminals to justice than our modest jail could ever hold. His service to law and order deserves recognition. He turned to Jed, that chilling smile widening. Pick any wife you like, Calloway. On the house. A gift from the court for your service. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Cruel, mocking laughter. Jed stood motionless, a cold anger building inside him. I'm not in the market, Judge, he said, his voice even. Nonsense, Patterson insisted. Every man needs a companion, someone to keep your bedroll warm. More laughter. Jed's gaze drifted to the women, to their downcast, humiliated eyes, all except one, the chained woman. She was staring right at him, her expression a challenge. I don't want a wife, Jed stated again firmly. Patterson's smile tightened. Consider it, Calloway. No man refuses a gift from this court. The words were a suggestion, but the tone was a threat. Jed had heard how Patterson's power had grown, how crossing him led to unfortunate accidents. Jed looked at the line of women again, his gaze locked with the woman in chains. There was something in her eyes, not just defiance. It was a desperate, silent message. He saw her eyes flick for a split second toward Patterson, then back to him. It was a plea, a warning. In that instant, a choice was made. A choice that would change everything. Jed raised his hand and pointed. Her, he said, his voice ringing out over the silent crowd. I choose her. Silence. A thick, shocked silence fell over the courthouse steps. Judge Patterson's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, hard calculation. Her, he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. You can have your pick of proper women, and you choose the criminal? You offered me any of them, Jed replied, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. I choose her. Patterson stared at Jed, trying to read his motives. What was his angle? What game was he playing? Finally, the judge gave a curt nod to the sheriff. Release her to Mr. Calloway's custody. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Reynolds, hesitated. Sir, she's awaiting trial on serious charges. I'm aware, Reynolds, Patterson snapped. But if Calloway wants to saddle himself with this particular burden, who are we to deny him? He turned back to Jed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper that only those on the steps could hear. She's unmanageable, Calloway. Wild. I won't be held responsible when she puts a knife in your back. I'll take my chances, Jed said, meeting Patterson's cold gaze. Sheriff Reynolds moved reluctantly toward the chained woman, keys jingling in his hand. As he knelt to unlock the shackles, Jed saw the raw, abraded skin beneath the iron. A slow, burning anger coiled in his gut. The chains fell away with a clatter. The woman stood perfectly still, as if she couldn't believe she was free. Reynolds gestured for her to go to Jed. She approached him cautiously, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden planks. Up close, Jed could see the dirt and bruises couldn't hide the dignity in her bearing. What's your name? He asked quietly. She studied him for a long moment before answering, her voice low and hoarse. Abigail Hayes. Most call me Abby. Let's go, Jed said. He turned to leave, not touching her, but aware of her following a step behind. As they descended the steps, the crowd parted for them like the Red Sea, their faces a mix of disgust and morbid curiosity. You'll regret this choice, Calloway, Patterson's voice boomed after them. That woman has a habit of seeing things she shouldn't and a mouth that could hang a man. Jed didn't turn back, but he felt Abby stiffen beside him. Whatever she had seen, whatever she knew, it was the reason for the chains. And now, for better or worse, it was his problem too. They had almost reached the edge of the crowd when a voice called out, Calloway, a word. Jed turned. It was Sheriff Reynolds, his hand resting casually on his gun. There was something familiar about the man. Jed placed him suddenly. Reynolds. Tom Reynolds. You were with the 3rd Colorado. A flicker of surprise crossed the sheriff's face. Didn't think you'd remember. I remember the men who fought beside me, Jed said simply. Reynolds glanced at Abby, then back at Jed. Walk with me a moment. Alone. Jed told Abby to wait, then followed the sheriff a short distance away, out of earshot. Reynolds seemed nervous, constantly scanning their surroundings. What are you doing, Calloway? He asked, his voice low and urgent. Do you have any idea what you've just stepped into? Enlighten me. Reynolds let out a sigh. That woman, Abby. She saw something that could get her killed. And now you too. What did she see? I can't. Reynolds cut himself off. He looked back toward the courthouse, then leaned in closer. Look, I owe you. Outside Richmond. That bullet would have found my heart if you hadn't pulled me down. Jed remembered the moment, the chaos of battle, a young private frozen in the open. So consider this me repaying the debt. Take that woman and ride out of Valley Creek today. Don't look back. Patterson won't let her live, Calloway. She knows too much. Jed processed the warning. The town he'd left 7 years ago was gone. This new Valley Creek was a snake pit, and Patterson was the snake. If she witnessed a crime, why isn't she under your protection? You're the sheriff. A bitter laugh escaped Reynolds' lips. Sheriff in name only. Patterson runs this town, this county. He's got judges and politicians in his pocket all the way to Denver. The last man who stood up to him ended up swinging from a cottonwood on trumped-up rustling charges. Shame crossed the sheriff's face. I have a family, Calloway. A wife, 2 boys. Patterson made it clear what would happen if I interfered. But I can at least try to keep you from ending up dead in a ditch. I appreciate the warning, Jed said slowly. Don't appreciate it. Heed it, Reynolds said, settling his hat back on his head. And this conversation never happened. Jed walked back to where Abby waited. Her eyes were sharp, suspicious. What did he want? To warn me, Jed said honestly. About me? And about Patterson, he replied. He saw something shift in her face. He hadn't lied. Maybe, just maybe, he could be trusted. We need to leave. Now. My horse is at the livery. He looked down at her bare, bruised feet. Can you walk that far? She met his gaze with grim determination. I've endured worse. Jed took off his heavy coat and held it out to her. Take this. It's getting colder. She hesitated, eyeing the coat with suspicion. Why are you helping me? It was a fair question. He wasn't entirely sure himself. Maybe it was the injustice of it all. Or maybe, after years of hunting the guilty, he simply recognized innocence when he saw it, even when it was covered in dirt and chains. Let's just say I don't much care for Patterson's version of justice, he said. Now take the coat. We have a long ride ahead of us. The livery stable smelled of hay and leather, familiar scents that spoke of escape. Jed's stallion, a powerful chestnut named Samson, nickered as he approached. Will he carry double? Abby asked, her eyes appraising the horse with an expert's glance. Jed was surprised. She knew horses. For a while, he confirmed, but we'll get you your own mount soon. He saw her wince as she shifted her weight. Her feet were a mess. Sit, he instructed, pointing to a hay bale. Let me see your feet. She hesitated, that familiar suspicion flickering in her eyes. You'll be no good to either of us if you can't walk, Jed said reasonably, and we may need to move fast. Reluctantly, she sat and extended her feet. They were lacerated and bruised, with angry red welts where the shackles had chafed her raw. Jed's jaw tightened. Without a word, he retrieved his saddlebags and pulled out a small medical kit. He knelt before her, gently cleaning the wounds with water from his canteen. His large, calloused hands were surprisingly gentle as he applied a salve to the worst of the abrasions. This will help with the pain, he explained, his voice low. Abby watched him, her guarded expression softening into curiosity. You've done this before. The war taught me some basic doctoring, he said, not looking up. He finished by pulling a clean pair of socks from his bag and handing them to her. "These will help until we can get you proper boots." She pulled them on, the simple comfort almost making her sigh. "Thank you," she said, the words coming with difficulty, as if gratitude were a foreign language. Jed just nodded and moved to saddle Samson. He could feel her watching him, studying his every move. "Why did you choose me?" she asked suddenly. "Back there, you could have walked away." He paused, his hands on the cinch. "The others had people willing to speak for them. You didn't." So it was pity. He turned to face her then, and their eyes met. "No," he said. "It was recognition." "Recognition of what?" "Of someone being punished for something other than what they're accused of," he said. "I've been a bounty hunter a long time. I know when the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Those chains weren't for some minor offense." A shadow crossed her face. "No," she whispered. "They weren't." Before she could say more, the stable door creaked open. They both spun around, Jed's hand instinctively going to his pistol. A young boy, maybe 12 years old, stood in the doorway looking anxious. "Mr. Calloway?" he asked. "Sheriff Reynolds sent me. He says to tell you. The judge has changed his mind. He's gathering men to come after you and the prisoner." Abby was on her feet in an instant. "We need to leave. Now." Jed tossed the boy a coin. "Thank Reynolds for me. Then forget you ever saw us." The boy pocketed the coin and vanished. In seconds, Jed had Abby on Samson's back and swung up behind her. He guided the horse not down the main street, but through a narrow alley, emerging onto a quiet side road leading out of town. They had almost reached the edge of the trees when Abby tensed in front of him. "Riders," she said quietly, nodding toward a rise ahead. 3 mounted men were silhouetted against the darkening sky, perfectly positioned to cut them off. "Hold on," Jed commanded, yanking Samson's reins and turning the horse sharply south toward a dense patch of woods. The stallion broke into a gallop, eating up the ground. A shout went up behind them. They'd been spotted. The thunder of hooves echoed behind them as the men gave chase. Jed urged Samson faster, plunging into the trees. The dense undergrowth would slow their pursuers, but it also slowed them down with double the weight on the horse's back. "They're gaining on us," Abby warned, glancing over his shoulder. "Not for long," he replied. He steered Samson behind a large, fallen log, momentarily out of sight. "Down!" he ordered, sliding from the saddle and helping her dismount. He quickly loosened the saddle, gave Samson a hard slap on the flank, and sent the horse running off deeper into the woods, leaving a clear trail for the men to follow. Jed pulled his Winchester free and crouched beside Abby behind the log. "Stay down," he murmured, "and don't make a sound." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. "Tracks lead east," one man called. "Spread out." The riders separated, their hoofbeats fading in different directions, but one set grew louder, coming straight for their hiding spot. Through a gap in the log, Jed saw a burly, bearded man dismount, rifle in hand. He was tracking them on foot. Beside him, Abby slowly reached down and wrapped her hand around a heavy rock. Jed gave her a warning look, but she just stared back, her grip tightening on the stone. The man was less than 20 feet away now. His eyes scanned the forest floor. He was good. Too good. His gaze passed over their hiding place, then snapped back, his eyes narrowing as he registered the unnatural shape of the log. "Found something," he called out, raising his rifle. In one fluid motion, Jed rose from behind the log, his own Winchester leveled. "Drop it," he commanded. The man froze, hesitating. For a tense second, Jed thought he would try his luck. Then, with a scowl, the man lowered his weapon. "Hands where I can see them," Jed ordered. "Who sent you?" "Judge Patterson wants the girl back," the man growled. "Says she's an escaped prisoner." "She's in my custody," Jed said firmly. The man's gaze flickered to something over Jed's shoulder. A small, cruel smile touched his lips. The judge doesn't like being refused. Jed sensed the movement behind him a second too late. Something hard crashed against the back of his head. Stars exploded in his vision, and he staggered forward, his grip on the Winchester slipping. He twisted as he fell, trying to bring the rifle to bear on his new attacker. The second man, Miller, stood over him, a heavy tree branch raised for another blow. Jed fired, the shot going wide as his vision swam, but it was enough to make Miller jump back. The first man lunged for his own rifle, but a blur of motion caught Jed's eye. "Abby!" She had burst from behind the log and hurled her rock with incredible force and accuracy. It struck the bearded man squarely on the temple with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, stunned. Miller recovered and lunged for Jed, his boot connecting hard with Jed's ribs. Pain shot through his chest. As Miller drew his boot back for another kick, Abby grabbed the fallen man's rifle and swung it like a club, catching Miller across the back. The blow wasn't powerful, but it was enough. It gave Jed the second he needed to roll away and struggle back to his feet. Miller snarled and turned on Abby, lunging for the rifle she now held. She backpedaled, trying to aim, but her injured feet slowed her down. Jed raised his Winchester. The crack of the rifle was deafening. Bark splintered from a tree just inches from Miller's head. "Next one won't miss," Jed promised, his voice deadly calm. Miller froze, then slowly raised his hands. The bearded man was stirring, getting unsteadily to his feet. "Tell Patterson that Abigail Hayes is under my protection now," Jed said, his rifle steady. "If he wants her, he'll have to come himself." "You're making a mistake, Calloway," the bearded man growled. "Nobody crosses the judge." "I'll take my chances," Jed said. "Now start walking back to town, and if I see either of you again, I won't waste time with warnings." The men exchanged a look, but the cold promise in Jed's eyes was enough. They turned and trudged back in the direction of Valley Creek. Jed waited until they were out of sight, then lowered his rifle, the adrenaline fading to leave only the throbbing pain in his head and ribs. His fingers came away bloody from the back of his neck. "Let me see," Abby said, her voice steady. Her hands were surprisingly gentle as she examined the wound. "It's not too deep. We need to clean it." Jed looked at her with new respect. "You handled yourself well back there." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I'm not as helpless as I appear." "So I've noticed." He winced as she probed the wound. "Where'd you learn to throw a rock like that?" "My father believed a girl should know how to defend herself." Her expression darkened. He was right. A distant sound of hoofbeats reminded them they weren't safe yet. The third man would be back. "We need to move," Jed said. He let out a sharp whistle. A moment later, Samson came trotting back through the trees. Jed quickly secured the saddle and helped Abby mount before climbing up behind her. "Which way?" she asked. Valley Creek was to the west. Patterson's men were to the east. North led to more populated areas. That left only one direction. South, Jed decided. "There's an old trapper's cabin in the foothills. Few people know it exists. We can rest there and figure out our next move." As Samson picked his way through the darkening forest, Jed was acutely aware of Abby sitting in front of him. She was stiff, her back straight, keeping as much distance as the saddle would allow. "You don't have to fear me," he said quietly. She didn't turn, but he felt some of the tension leave her. "I don't fear you," she replied after a moment. "But trust doesn't come easily to me anymore." "Fair enough," he said. "But if we're going to survive this, we'll need to trust each other." He paused. "Patterson won't stop with just those 3 men. Whatever you saw, he considers it worth killing for." She was silent for a long time. Finally, when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He killed a man. Marshall Weaver. I saw it." Jed wasn't surprised. It confirmed everything he suspected. "You witnessed it?" She nodded. "I was cleaning the courthouse late one night. I heard them arguing. Patterson and the marshal. I saw everything through a partially open door. Patterson caught me watching as I tried to slip away. Jed felt a cold dread creep up his spine. What happened then? His men chased me. I made it to the church before they could catch me. She stopped, her voice thick with grief. The church? Jed prompted gently. My father was the pastor there, she said, the words heavy with pain. He tried to protect me. He tried to reason with Patterson. Her voice broke. They killed him too. They made it look like an accident, a fire. The word hit Jed like a physical blow. Fire. The same word that had defined his life for 7 years. The same cruel fate that had stolen his family. I'm sorry, he said, the words feeling hollow, inadequate. They held me in the jail for weeks, she continued, the words tumbling out now, a torrent of pain and injustice. They said I killed Marshall Weaver, said I would hang unless I recanted what I'd seen, when I refused. Patterson decided the auction would be a more public humiliation, a warning to anyone else who might think of crossing him. Jed's grip on the reins tightened. His knuckles were white. The calculated cruelty of it was monstrous. It wasn't just about silencing her. It was about breaking her spirit first. How long ago did this happen? My father died a month ago, she whispered. The marshal, a week before that. He knew that pain, the raw, gaping wound of fresh grief. Yet Abby had endured it all. She had found the strength to fight, to maintain her dignity even in chains. We'll find a way, he promised, the words coming out before he could even think about their implications. We'll bring Patterson to justice. She turned slightly to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the gloom. Why? Why would you risk your life for a stranger? He met her gaze. It was time for the truth. Because 7 years ago I lost my wife and my daughter in a fire, right here in Valley Creek. The authorities called it an accident. I was away on a bounty. But I've never believed it. Understanding dawned in her expression. You think Patterson was involved? I don't know, Jed admitted. But I know this town changed after he arrived, and I've carried the weight of not being there to protect my family every single day since. Maybe helping you is a way to finally do something right. She turned back to face forward. I'm sorry about your family, she said softly. They rode on in silence, a new, unspoken bond forged between them in the darkness. 2 lives, shattered by the same fire, the same man. The first stars were appearing when Jed finally guided Samson up a narrow, hidden path. Almost there, he said. The cabin was nestled against a hillside, small but sturdy. It looked like it had grown right out of the mountain. Jed helped Abby dismount, steadying her as she stumbled on her injured feet. It's not much, he said, but it's safe. The inside was simple, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough table, and a narrow bed. Jed lit a lamp and started a fire. The crackling flames pushed back the cold and the darkness. You should rest, he said, gesturing to the bed. I'll keep watch. She hesitated. And where will you sleep? The floor suits me fine, he said, pulling a clean shirt from his saddlebag and offering it to her. You might want to change. There's water in the basin. She took the shirt with a nod. While she washed, Jed stepped outside to tend to Samson. The night air was crisp and cold. He could see his breath in the moonlight. He had come back to Valley Creek to visit a grave, to close a chapter. Instead, he had opened a whole new book, a dangerous book, filled with corruption and murder. And at the center of it was a woman with eyes that burned with the same fire of loss that he carried in his own heart. He touched the wound on the back of his head. He had survived worse. His ribs ached, but nothing was broken. When he went back inside, Abby was sitting at the table. His shirt was loose on her small frame. She had washed her face and combed her hair with her fingers. The bruise on her cheek stood out starkly against her clean skin. Your head needs tending, she said. He sat down opposite her and handed her the medical kit. Her fingers were gentle and efficient as she cleaned the wound. "You were lucky," she commented. "Another inch lower, and it might have fractured your skull." "Wouldn't be the first time," he replied wryly. "You've had a hard life, haven't you, Mr. Calloway?" "Jed," he corrected her, "and no harder than most." She finished her work and looked at him, her gaze direct. "My father was a chaplain during the war. He never spoke of what he saw, but his nightmares told their own story." She paused. "And now Patterson will pay for what he did to him. To Marshall Weaver. To all the people he's wronged." The conviction in her voice was absolute. But Jed recognized the dangerous edge to it. He had walked that same path himself, the one where justice blurs into vengeance. "Justice is what matters," he said carefully. "Not revenge. There's a difference." Her eyes flashed in the firelight. "Is there? When the law itself is corrupted by men like Patterson, what difference remains?" It was a fair question, one he had wrestled with in the darkest hours of the night for 7 long years. "Intent," he answered finally. "Justice seeks to restore balance. Revenge only seeks to inflict more pain." She considered his words, her gaze drifting to the dancing flames. "And which are you seeking, Jed Calloway?" The question hung between them, heavy and unanswered. Before he could reply, she swayed slightly in her chair, exhaustion finally winning its battle against her will. "You need to rest," he said, rising and gently guiding her toward the narrow bed. As she settled under the rough woolen blanket, she looked up at him, a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "What if they find us here?" He checked his revolver before sliding it back into its holster. "They won't," he said, "but if they do, they'll regret it." He extinguished the lamp, leaving only the warm glow of the fire. "Sleep now. You're safe." As Abby's eyes closed, Jed settled into the chair by the fire, his Winchester across his knees. Outside, an owl hooted, its mournful cry echoing across the valley. Jed stared into the flames, his mind reeling. 7 years of empty, solitary existence had been shattered in a single day, shattered by a woman whose quiet strength reminded him of everything he had lost. Whatever came next, whatever danger Patterson sent to their door, one thing was certain. He would not fail again. This time, he would be there to protect what mattered, whatever the cost. Dawn broke over the mountains, filtering through the cabin's single window. Jed had kept his vigil through the night, dozing but never sleeping. He watched Abby stir. In repose, she looked younger. The weight of her grief momentarily lifted. Her eyes snapped open, instantly alert. She took in the unfamiliar surroundings, then her gaze found Jed, and memory returned. "You stayed awake all night," she observed. "Force of habit," he replied, rising and stretching his stiff muscles. He moved to the small stove, stoking the embers from last night's fire. "There's jerky and coffee. Not much of a breakfast, but it'll keep us going." They ate in silence, the quiet comfort of the small cabin a stark contrast to the danger that lay just outside its walls. "What happens now?" Abby asked, setting down her cup. Jed had been thinking about that all night. "Patterson will have men watching every road, every town. We need supplies, but we can't risk it." "There's a trading post about 15 miles south," Abby suggested. "Run by a Ute family. My father used to visit them. They might help us." He was impressed. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor, already thinking, planning. "You know the way?" She nodded. "I've made the journey several times. The Browns are good people. They have no love for Patterson." "Then that's our destination," Jed decided. "But our larger problem remains. Patterson won't stop hunting you." Abby's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we need to find the proof that will expose him. The proof my father died for." "What kind of proof?" Her eyes were intense. Before he died, he was collecting evidence of Patterson's land fraud scheme. Documents, witness testimonies, copies of falsified deeds. He kept everything in a hidden compartment built beneath the church altar. Jed frowned. If Patterson killed your father, wouldn't he have searched the church? He did, Abby confirmed, but the compartment was my father's secret. He showed it to me when I was a child, made me promise never to tell a soul. And you think it's still there? Yes, she said, a flicker of hope in her eyes. It's my only chance to bring him to justice, to make my father's death mean something. Jed saw the danger in her plan. Returning to Valley Creek was suicide. Patterson would have men watching every corner of that town. It's too risky, he said. What's the alternative? She shot back, her voice steady. Run forever? Live in fear? I can't do that, Jed. I won't. He saw the same fire in her that had driven him for 7 years. An unquenchable need for answers, for justice. It was a dangerous fire, one that could consume you if you let it. But he also knew he couldn't deny her. He couldn't deny himself. All right, he said finally. We'll need a plan, a way to get into town, get the evidence, and get out without being seen. Relief softened her features. Thank you, she said simply. Don't thank me yet, he replied, gathering their empty cups. First, let's get those supplies. Then we can figure out how to walk into the lion's den without getting eaten. The trading post was a sturdy log cabin set in a clearing beside a rushing creek. Smoke curled from its chimney. Jed reined Samson in at the edge of the trees, his senses on high alert. Wait here, he told Abby. Let me make sure it's safe. He dismounted, his hand hovering near his pistol. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, or if you hear gunfire, take Samson and ride north. There's another cabin about 5 miles up the valley. I'm not leaving you behind, she stated firmly. This isn't a debate, he said, his voice stern. If something happens to me, your priority is to protect that evidence. Understood? She nodded reluctantly. Jed approached the trading post cautiously. Just as he reached the porch, the door opened and 2 rough-looking men stepped out. Jed tensed, but they just mounted their horses and rode off, ignoring him completely. He stepped inside. The interior was dim and smelled of leather and spices. A middle-aged Native American man with graying hair and watchful eyes stood behind the counter. Morning, Jed said. What can I help you with, friend? The man asked. Supplies, Jed replied, and information if you're willing to sell it. The man's eyes sharpened. Information costs more than goods these days. I'm looking for trouble, Jed said. Or rather, how to avoid it. The kind that comes from Valley Creek. The man studied him for a long moment. You're Calloway, he stated, the bounty hunter. Jed's hand drifted closer to his gun. You have me at a disadvantage. Joseph Brown, the man introduced himself, and you can relax. If I meant you harm, we wouldn't be having this conversation. He leaned forward. Word travels fast. Judge Patterson is offering good money for information about you and a woman. And yet you haven't sent for his men, Jed observed. A ghost of a smile touched Brown's lips. Patterson and I have a difference of opinion regarding who owns this land. He believes his paper gives him the right to it. I believe my family's 100 years here counts for more. He had tried to seize the trading post, first with offers, then with threats. As if on cue, a beaded curtain behind the counter parted, and a younger man emerged, holding a shotgun. He looked formidable. My son, Thomas, Brown said, West Point graduate, returned home to help defend what's ours. Jed knew he'd found allies. I have someone with me, he said. Abigail Hayes, Reverend Hayes's daughter. She witnessed Patterson murder Marshall Weaver. Recognition flashed in Brown's eyes. The Reverend was a good man, one of the few who treated my people with respect. If his daughter needs sanctuary, she'll find it here. When Jed returned with Abby, the Browns welcomed her with genuine warmth. Thomas's wife, Sarah, a kind-faced woman with intelligent eyes, immediately took Abby under her wing, providing her with clean clothes, proper boots, and a hot meal. Meanwhile, Joseph Brown led Jed to a back room where a map of the territory was spread on a table. "Patterson's influence extends throughout this entire region," Brown explained, tracing a large circle on the map. "He has the sheriff, the land commission, most local businesses under his control." "How did one man get so much power?" Jed asked. "He came with money and connections after the war," Brown said, "presented himself as a man of law and order. By the time people realized his true nature, it was too late." "We need to get into the church in Valley Creek," Jed said, tracing the route on the map. "Undetected." Brown considered this. "The main roads will be watched. But there are older paths, hunting trails my people have used for generations." He pointed to a winding route that approached the town from the northwest. "This trail comes in right behind the church cemetery. It's overgrown, but passable. Thomas can guide you." "Why would he take such a risk for us?" Jed asked. Brown's expression turned grave. "Because Patterson's corruption threatens us all, and because," he lowered his voice, "Thomas's sister was married to a settler whose land Patterson seized. When her husband protested, he was found hanging from a tree, allegedly for horse theft. She died of grief a few weeks later." The web of Patterson's evil was wider and darker than Jed had imagined. Later, as Jed sat on the porch cleaning his Winchester, Abby joined him. She was transformed. Dressed in a simple skirt and blouse, her hair neatly braided, she looked less like a fugitive and more like the pastor's daughter she was. The bruise was still there, a faint purple shadow, but it no longer defined her. "Sarah gave me this," Abby said, holding up a small, well-maintained revolver. She insisted. "Do you know how to use it?" Jed asked. "My father taught me," she replied, "though I've never fired at anything but targets." "Taking a life changes a man," Jed said quietly, his eyes on the distant mountains, "even when it's necessary." She studied his weathered face. "You've killed many men." It was a statement, not a question. "In the war," he said, "and some after. When my job required it, I take no pride in it. And yet you continue." He sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of years. "After Elizabeth and Sarah died, I needed a purpose. Bringing criminals to justice seemed straightforward. Right and wrong, clearly defined. No complications, no attachments." "And now?" she asked softly. He met her gaze. "Now? I'm not so sure of anything, except that Patterson needs to be stopped." They sat in silence as the afternoon sun slanted through the pines. Joseph Brown had told them they would leave for Valley Creek at midnight. Thomas would guide them along the secret trail, bringing them to the church by dawn. "Are you certain you want to do this?" Jed asked. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she replied, her voice firm. "My father died trying to expose Patterson. I owe it to him to finish what he started." "Then we'll see it done," he promised. "Together." As the word left his lips, Jed realized it had been 7 years since he'd been a part of any together. The feeling was strange, unfamiliar, like a ghost limb beginning to feel again. It was hope, and it was terrifying. The forest at midnight was a world of shadows and whispers. Thomas Brown moved through it like a phantom, silent and sure-footed. Jed and Abby followed, their horses stepping carefully on the ancient hidden trail. They rode for hours, the moon a sliver of silver through the dense canopy of pines. Just before dawn, they reached the edge of the church cemetery. The white steeple rose against the fading stars, a lonely sentinel guarding the sleeping town. "I'll hold the horses here," Thomas whispered. "If there's trouble, I'll create a diversion. Get the evidence to me and ride for Denver." Jed clasped the man's shoulder in silent thanks. He turned to Abby. "Stay close." They moved through the cemetery like ghosts, slipping from one headstone to the next. The air was cold and still, The church was dark, silent. Abby led him to a small side door. She produced a key from her pocket. "My father always made sure I had a way into God's house," she whispered. The lock turned with a faint click. The door opened with a groan that sounded like a scream in the pre-dawn quiet. They slipped inside, their hearts pounding. The church smelled of old wood and candle wax. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the pews in ghostly colors. Abby moved directly to the altar. Jed stood watch by the door, his revolver drawn, every nerve tingling. Outside, the sky was slowly turning from black to gray. The world was waking up. They were running out of time. "Here," Abby whispered. A soft click, and a small section of the altar's front panel swung open, revealing a dark, hidden compartment. She reached inside and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a thick, leather-bound ledger and a stack of folded documents. "This is it," she breathed. "My father's evidence." A floorboard creaked in the vestibule. They froze, eyes locked in silent alarm. Someone else was in the church. Jed motioned for Abby to stay hidden behind the altar. He moved silently toward the sound, his revolver leading the way. The vestibule was empty, but the main door was slightly ajar. He was certain they had closed it. A whisper of movement behind him made him spin around, his gun raised. An old woman stood there, a broom clutched in her hands. She gasped, "Mr. Calloway?" Before Jed could react, Abby emerged from behind the altar. "Martha," she said softly. The woman's eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears of joy. "Miss Abby, oh, thank the Lord." She rushed forward and embraced Abby. "We thought you were lost to us." "Can we trust her?" Jed asked Abby, his gun still warily in his hand. "Yes," Abby said without hesitation. "Martha has been part of this church since before I was born. She helped my father with his work." Martha's face hardened at the mention of Patterson's name. "That man has much to answer for," she said grimly. "We have the evidence," Abby told her, patting the bundle under her coat. "Everything needed to bring him to justice." Hope and fear warred in Martha's eyes. "You'll need help. Patterson's men are everywhere." "We have a friend waiting with horses," Jed explained. "That won't be possible," Martha interrupted, her voice trembling. She peered cautiously out a window. "They're already here. Patterson's men are surrounding the church." Jed joined her at the window. She was right. Mounted men were visible at the edge of the cemetery, and more were approaching on foot from the town. They were trapped. "How did they know?" Abby asked, her voice tight with panic. Martha's face crumpled with guilt. I fear it may be my fault. When I arrived, I found the side door unlocked. I thought it was thieves. I ran to get help." "Who did you tell?" Jed demanded. "Sheriff Reynolds," she admitted, her eyes widening in horrified realization. "He must have told Patterson." So Reynolds had been playing him all along. The warning, the help from the boy, it was all a setup, a trap. And they had walked right into it. Shouts from outside confirmed it. They were discovered. "Is there another way out?" Jed asked Martha urgently. The old woman hesitated, then nodded. "The tunnel." "Tunnel?" Jed and Abby said in unison. "During the war," Martha explained quickly, "Reverend Hayes helped escaping slaves. He had a tunnel built from the basement to an old mining shaft about a half a mile away. She led them to a door near the pulpit. "This way! Quickly!" As they hurried down a narrow staircase, Jed grabbed Abby's arm. "If this is another trap—" "It's not," she assured him. "Martha wouldn't betray us." The basement was cool and musty. Martha pushed on a specific stone in the far wall. With a grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. "It hasn't been used in years," she warned, handing Abby a lantern. Shouts from upstairs grew louder. They were coming down. "Go with God, child," Martha said, embracing Abby one last time. "And bring that devil Patterson to justice." Jed pushed Abby into the tunnel, then turned back to Martha. What will you tell them? That I found nothing, she said with surprising steadiness. He gave her a final nod of thanks and slipped into the darkness. Martha sealed the entrance behind them. The tunnel was claustrophobic, the air stale with the scent of damp earth. The only light was the wavering flame of the lantern in Abby's hand. They moved as quickly as they could, the sounds from the church fading behind them. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel began to slope upward. Dim, natural light filtered down from above. They were close. The passage opened into an old, dilapidated mining chamber. At the far end, a shaft of morning light shone through an opening concealed by overgrown brush. Jed peered out. The shaft emerged in a small ravine, some distance from the church. It looked clear. But their escape route was gone. Thomas and the horses were back at the cemetery. They were on foot, in hostile territory, with Patterson's men scouring every inch of the land around them. They emerged from the mine shaft, blinking in the bright morning sun. "Which way?" Abby asked, clutching the precious bundle of evidence. Before Jed could answer, they heard hoofbeats. He pulled her back into the cover of the mine entrance. The sound grew louder, closer. "Get back inside," he whispered. "Wait," Abby interrupted, her eyes fixed on the ridge above them. "Look." A lone rider appeared, silhouetted against the sky. As he guided his horse carefully down the steep slope of the ravine, Jed saw he was leading two other mounts behind him. It was Thomas Brown. "Thomas!" Abby breathed in relief. "But how?" "I saw them surround the church," he explained as he reached them, his expression grim. "Figured you'd need another way out. My grandfather once told me about a secret path from the church, from darker days." He handed them the reins to the other horses. "We need to move. Patterson's men are searching in ever-widening circles." As they mounted, Jed noticed Thomas favoring his left arm. It was wrapped in a crude, bloody bandage. "You're injured." Thomas grimaced. "Had a disagreement with two of Patterson's men who got too close to our hiding place. They won't be following us." The implication was clear. "Which way now?" Jed asked. "Not back to the trading post," Thomas said. "They'll look there first. I know another place. An old trapper's cabin, well hidden in the foothills." They rode hard, Thomas leading them through the rugged wilderness. An hour later, he raised his hand, signaling them to halt. The forest had gone silent. Too silent. He pointed to a ridge ahead. Even at a distance, Jed could see the movement of riders, methodically sweeping the terrain. "Patterson's men," Thomas whispered. "They're between us and the cabin." There were at least 6 of them. They were cut off. "We could split up," Jed suggested grimly. "I could draw them off while you two get away with the evidence." "No," Abby said immediately, her voice firm. "We stay together." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Divided, we're vulnerable. Together, we have a chance." He gestured toward a shallow creek bed nearby. "The water will hide our tracks." They followed the creek for miles, the cold water numbing their legs but providing the concealment they desperately needed. When they finally stopped to rest, the distant but unmistakable sound of a hunting horn echoed through the hills. "They're coordinating their search," Thomas said, his face grave. "And they're closer than I thought." They pushed on, the terrain growing more difficult, the horses laboring up steep inclines. From a high ridge, they could see the searchers below moving in an organized pattern. Patterson had brought in professional trackers. "We have to cross that open ridge to get to the valley where the cabin is," Thomas said, pointing. It was a long, exposed stretch of land, a death trap. They waited, hidden in the trees, as a group of riders passed below. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, the riders disappeared from view. "Now!" Jed urged. They burst from the cover of the trees, galloping across the exposed ridge. Every second they expected to hear a shout, the crack of a rifle. But they reached the other side without raising an alarm. Their luck had held. For now. They finally reached the hidden cabin as dusk was falling. It was a tiny one-room shelter, but it was solid, and its location was perfectly concealed. While Thomas tended to the horses, Jed and Abby went inside. She started a small fire, its warm light pushing back the shadows. She carefully unwrapped the oilcloth bundle on the cabin's single table. "This is everything," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "My father's legacy." Jed stood beside her. They opened the ledger. Page after page of meticulous notes in her father's hand. Names, dates, fraudulent land transactions, witness statements. It was all there, a detailed map of Patterson's crimes. As they studied the documents, a horrifying pattern emerged. The land seizures weren't random. They followed a deliberate path, a corridor of properties stretching from Valley Creek toward the territorial capital. "The railroad," Jed breathed, the pieces clicking into place. "He's acquiring land along the proposed railway route." "My father suspected as much," Abby said grimly. "Patterson stands to make a fortune." A terrible suspicion formed in Jed's mind. "Show me where my old homestead was," he asked, his throat suddenly dry. Abby turned to a map at the back of the ledger. Jed's finger traced the familiar boundaries of his land, the land where he had built a life with Elizabeth and Sarah. And there, marked clearly in Reverend Hayes's careful hand, was his former property, now registered to a holding company controlled by Harrison Patterson. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He felt the floor drop out from under him. The fire 7 years ago, the accident that had stolen his family. It was no accident. "It wasn't an accident," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "The fire that killed my wife and daughter. It was Patterson." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The grief he had carried for 7 years ignited into a white-hot rage. His family hadn't died by chance. They had been murdered. A calculated part of Patterson's monstrous scheme. Abby placed her hand over his. "I'm so sorry, Jed." He looked up from the map and met her gaze. He saw his own pain reflected in her eyes. "We'll make him pay," Jed vowed, his voice raw. "Not just for your father or for my family, but for everyone." "Justice, not revenge," she reminded him gently, echoing his own words. "Justice," Jed agreed, though the line between the two had never felt so thin, so fragile. Thomas entered the cabin then. "What is it? What have you found?" "Confirmation," Jed said, his voice cold as steel, "that Patterson is a murderer, and he murdered my family." The gravity of the moment settled over the small cabin. This was no longer just about exposing a corrupt judge. It was personal. It was about vengeance. It was about avenging the dead. As Jed stared at the map, at the black ink that represented the stolen lives and shattered dreams, another document slipped from the pages of the ledger. It was a letter, a personal letter, in Reverend Hayes's handwriting, addressed to whoever finds this evidence. With trembling hands, Jed opened it. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then I have likely gone to meet my Maker. I pray this evidence finds its way to someone with the courage to use it justly. But I must add a final, terrible truth. The investigation into Patterson's crimes did not begin with me. 7 years ago, a woman named Elizabeth Calloway began asking questions about the land seizures. Her husband, Jedediah, was away at the time. Before he could return, Elizabeth and their young daughter Sarah perished in a fire that I now believe was deliberately set on Patterson's orders." Jed stopped reading. The air left his lungs. Elizabeth. His Elizabeth. She hadn't just been a victim, she had been a hero. She had been fighting back. She had known the truth, and for that, she and their innocent daughter had paid the ultimate price. He looked across the cabin at Abby's sleeping form. 2 families, intertwined by a tragedy that was deeper and darker than he had ever imagined. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the ledger. Outside, a wolf howled, its lonely cry echoing through the mountains. Patterson's men were out there, hunting them. But inside the small cabin, a new, terrible resolve had taken root in Jed's heart. This was no longer just about justice. This was about a promise made to a ghost, a promise that he would finish what his wife had started. He would burn Patterson's world to the ground, just as the judge had burned his, and he would do it with the truth. They rode southwest, away from Denver, a desperate gamble based on a note in the Reverend's ledger. A territorial judge, Samuel Harrington, a man rumored to be immune to Patterson's influence, was holding court in a town called Silver Falls. It was their last hope. The journey was brutal. Days of hard riding, of sleeping under the stars with one eye open, of sharing the last of their food. The bond between Jed and Abby deepened, forged in the crucible of shared danger and shared grief. The walls Jed had built around his heart for 7 years began to crumble. He saw in her not just a reflection of his own pain, but a strength and resilience that stirred something long dormant within him. Hope. But when they finally reached Silver Falls, their hope turned to ash. "Patterson's men are here," Thomas reported grimly, returning from a scouting trip into town. "At least a dozen of them, watching the courthouse, watching the roads, and worse. Judge Harrington is gone," Abby discovered after a daring solo trip into town, disguised as a widow. "Left yesterday for Denver on urgent business. His clerk was suspicious. I think he knew who I was." They were trapped. Patterson had anticipated their every move. His net was closing. As they huddled in an abandoned barn on the edge of town, they heard the thunder of hooves. A posse, riding hard from town. They had been discovered. "We have to move!" Jed yelled, and they burst from the back of the barn, galloping for the cover of a nearby forest. The chase was on. Bullets whizzed past their heads as they plunged into the dense trees. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and their horses were exhausted. "This way!" Thomas shouted, leading them into a narrow, rocky ravine. "They'll have trouble following with horses." It was a good plan, but Patterson's men were relentless. A rifleman took a position on the ridge above, pinning them down with accurate fire. They were caught in a kill box. "We have to split up," Jed decided, his mind racing. "It's our only chance. The evidence is what matters. It has to reach Denver, with or without me." Abby's eyes filled with fear, but she knew he was right. She quickly tore several key documents from the ledger, the ones that directly implicated Patterson in the murders, and pressed them into Jed's hand. "In case we're separated," she said, her voice trembling. "This way, if only one of us makes it." "I'll find you," Jed promised, his gaze intense. "The double-peaked mountain northeast of here. I'll meet you there." With a final nod, he set his trap. He created a small explosion with a few cartridges and a fire, drawing the attention of their pursuers. As Thomas and Abby escaped deeper into the ravine, Jed scrambled up the opposite slope, deliberately making himself a target. The chase began in earnest, Jed on foot against mounted professional trackers. He used every trick he knew, every lesson the wilderness had taught him, to stay one step ahead. As dusk fell, he stopped at a spring to drink. The attack came without warning. A man burst from the trees, tackling him to the ground. He was lean, weathered, with the dead eyes of a killer. And Jed recognized him. From a faded photograph in the back of Reverend Hayes's ledger, a hired gun Patterson used for his dirtiest work. The man who had set the fire. "Calloway," the tracker snarled, a knife glinting in the fading light. "The judge wants you alive, but he didn't specify undamaged." The fight was brutal, primal, a dance of knives and fists. They were both wounded, bleeding, their strength failing. Jed could hear the other riders approaching. He had to end it, now. In a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he overpowered the tracker, driving the man's own knife into his chest. As life faded from the killer's eyes, Jed saw not victory, but another ghost to add to his collection. He quickly searched the body, finding a map of the region marked with the search patterns of Patterson's men. A priceless piece of intelligence. He staggered back into the forest just as the other riders arrived, their shouts of fury echoing behind him. He traveled through the night, guided by the stars, his wounds screaming with every step. He finally collapsed from exhaustion, waking at dawn, stiff and cold, but alive. The map showed the rendezvous point was 5 miles away. It might as well have been 100. He forced himself to his feet and began the agonizing journey. When he finally reached the plateau below the Twin Peaks, it was empty. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. Had they been caught? Had he failed them? He collapsed behind a rock, his rifle across his lap, and waited. Hours passed. The sun began to set, and then he saw them. 2 riders, moving slowly up the slope. Abby and Thomas. Relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. "We thought we'd lost you," Abby cried as she dismounted, rushing to his side. Her eyes took in his blood-stained clothes, his makeshift bandages. "You're hurt." "It looks worse than it is," he lied. They had been followed for miles, only shaking their pursuers by doubling back across a river in the dead of night. Patterson's men were everywhere. They were surrounded. Jed spread the tracker's map on a rock. "This shows their search patterns," he explained. "They're covering every road to Denver." Thomas studied the map. "There's a gap," he said, pointing to a treacherous mountain passage to the southeast. "They don't think anyone would be foolish enough to try it this time of year. The snows have already begun." "Then that's where we go," Jed decided. It was their only way through. The mountain passage was a frozen hell, a narrow, icy trail clinging to the side of sheer cliffs. A blizzard descended upon them, the wind a howling demon, the snow blinding. They found shelter in a crude, 3-walled hunter's cabin, huddling around a small fire as the storm raged. Their food was gone. Their hope was dwindling. Just as the storm began to break, Thomas spotted them. At the far end of the valley, where the passage ended, a group of riders waited. Patterson's men. They had been anticipated. They were trapped again. The plan was desperate, bordering on suicide. Thomas would create a diversion, drawing off some of the men. Jed and Abby would charge through the gap, relying on speed and surprise to break through. 3 days, Thomas said, clasping Jed's hand. "Meet me at my father's trading post." He disappeared into the swirling snow. Moments later, rifle shots echoed from the far side of the valley. The diversion had begun. "Now!" Jed yelled. They burst from the passage at a full gallop, a desperate charge into the teeth of the enemy. Surprise was on their side. They were almost through when Abby's horse stumbled. A rider closed in on her, his pistol raised. Jed wheeled his horse around, firing his own revolver, driving the man back. They broke through the line and disappeared into the trees on the far side, a hail of bullets chasing them. They rode through the night, pushing their horses to their absolute limit. By dawn, their pursuers had found their trail again. They were running on fumes, their horses on the verge of collapse. They made their last stand in a narrow canyon, a desperate firefight against impossible odds. Jed's horse was shot out from under him. "Keep going," he shouted to Abby, providing covering fire from behind the fallen animal. "Get to the bottom!" He scrambled down the canyon wall, rejoining her among the cottonwood trees. They were on foot now, with one exhausted horse between them. They took cover behind a cluster of boulders, their ammunition almost gone. This was the end of the line. "If they take us," Abby said, her voice steady, "I want you to destroy the evidence. I won't let Patterson use it to harm anyone else." Jed nodded grimly. He prepared to burn the ledger, to turn their last hope to ash. That's when they heard it. Not the sound of Patterson's men. It was a different sound. A rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the air itself. A band of Ute warriors appeared at the end of the canyon, riding hard, their faces painted for war. Jed and Abby braced for a new threat, but the lead rider called out in perfect English, "Jedediah Calloway, Thomas Brown sent us." Relief, pure and absolute. Thomas had made it to the Ute camp. Their allies had arrived. The Ute warriors had already intercepted and driven back Patterson's men. They were safe. As they rode out of the canyon, surrounded by their rescuers, the path to Denver finally seemed clear. The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the path ahead. Jed looked at Abby, riding beside him, her head held high. In her strength, he had found his own. In her hope, he had rediscovered a future he thought was lost forever. The journey to Denver was swift and silent, guided by the Ute warriors who knew every secret path, every hidden trail. They arrived in the territorial capital under the cover of darkness, ghosts slipping into the heart of their enemy's power. Joseph Brown was waiting for them, having arrived ahead with fresh supplies and a plan. Judge Harrington had indeed been called to Denver, but it wasn't by Patterson. It was by a concerned senator who had been secretly receiving reports from Reverend Hayes for months. The Reverend had been building a network of his own. The judge wasn't running from them, he was waiting for them. The meeting took place in a heavily guarded hotel room. Judge Harrington, a man with a stern face and honest eyes, listened intently as Abby, her voice clear and strong, told their story. Jed laid the ledger on the table. The proof, the truth, written in blood and ink. Warrants were issued before sunrise. Territorial marshals, loyal to Harrington, descended on Valley Creek. Sheriff Reynolds, who had played both sides, was the first to be arrested. He confessed everything, implicating Patterson in a web of corruption and murder that shocked the territory. But Patterson was gone. Tipped off by his network of spies, he had fled. Jed knew where he would go. There was only one place left for a man like that. Home, the land he had stolen. Jed's land. He rode back to Valley Creek alone. He found Patterson at the ashes of his old homestead, a desperate man standing on the grave of his victims. The final confrontation wasn't a blaze of gunfire. It was quiet, cold. Two men linked by a tragedy 7 years in the making. Patterson tried to bargain, tried to threaten, but his power was gone. His empire had crumbled. Jed just looked at him, the cold emptiness inside him finally filled with a quiet peace. He didn't pull the trigger. Revenge was a poison, and he was finally ready to be healed. He just held Patterson at gunpoint until the marshals arrived. Justice was served. Patterson was tried and hanged. His network was dismantled. The stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners. The town of Valley Creek began to heal. A few weeks later, Jed stood with Abby in the cemetery, in front of the small stone marker. He placed a fresh bouquet of wildflowers at its base. The ache was still there, a dull throb where a gaping wound had been. But it was different now. It was the scar of a wound that had finally begun to close. "What will you do now?" Abby asked softly. Jed looked out at the valley, at the land that was once again his. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in a long time, I'm not hunting anything. It feels strange." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "Maybe it's time to start building instead." He looked at her, at this remarkable woman who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. He saw not a future free of pain, but one filled with possibility. A future he never thought he would have. A future he wanted to build with her. "Maybe it is," he said, and for the first time in 7 years he smiled back. A real smile. A smile that reached his eyes. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for more tales that prove that even in the darkest of times, the truth will always find a way. Thanks for watching.